Richard Neibuhr, wrote a pretty well-known book, Christ and Culture. And I have to confess, I've never read it. I'm not a Niebuhr scholar. I'm familiar with the Niebuhrs. This book has, from what I understood, stood the test of time. The Niebuhrs are considered sort of liberals by some today, but at the time, I think they were, relatively orthodox and conservative. But Christ and Culture is the name of the book, and like I said, I ran across a kind of snippet from that book, and it's a summary, really, of 5 positions relating to Christ and Culture. So I'm just going to read that, and to give all credit, this is from For All the Saints. That's published by the American Lutheran Publicity Bureau, alpp.org, alpb.org. And it's a daily devotional, 3 Bible readings a day. And I shouldn't say, but I put out a daily podcast that is Bible reading, and it's basically reading the 2-year daily lectionary from this book, and that's kind of how I stumbled across this reading from Richard Neibuhr. But anyway, let me read from it. It's a little bit of a departure from what I often do on the show, which is maybe to look at more, topical things in the news. We're going to do some of that. I'm going to apply some stuff going on today to this article, or to this snippet from this book. But I just thought every now and then you need to have something kind of foundational, and Niebuhr does a really good job here of laying out possibilities when we consider the way in which Christ relates to culture. So, reflecting on the relationship of Christ to culture, this is what he writes. He says, 5 sorts of answers are distinguished, of which 3 are closely related to each other as belonging to that median type in which both Christ and culture are distinguished and affirmed. Yet strange family resemblances may be found among the whole scale. All right, so, answers of the first type emphasize the opposition between Christ and culture. Okay, so again, he's looking at the relationship between Christ and culture. What is the degree to which Christ impacts the culture? What is the degree to which Christ, and his followers remove themselves from the culture? Can they have a salutary team and partnership, or are they mutually exclusive? And basically, there are the 5 responses. So the first one is, I think, maybe the most obvious, and we've seen it on and off throughout the history of the church, which is that they oppose each other. Whatever may be the customs of the society in which the Christian lives, and whatever the human achievements it conserves, Christ is seen as opposed to them, so that he confronts men with the challenge of an either-or decision. In medieval times, monastic orders and sectarian movements called on believers living in what purported to be a Christian culture to abandon the world, quote-unquote, and to, quote, come out from among them and be separate. In the modern period, answers of this kind are given by missionaries who require their converts to abandon wholly the customs and institutions of so-called quote-unquote heathen societies, by little groups of withdrawing Christians in Western or Christianized civilization, and in partial manner by those who emphasize the antagonism of Christian faith to capitalism and communism, to industrialism and nationalism, to Catholicism and Protestantism. So, in other words, he's saying, whatever the culture is, Christ is opposed to it, basically. Whatever the traditions of the culture are going to be wrong. And an example he gives are the monastic movements. They looked around at the society, they thought, oh, geez, this is a lot of rot here in this society. We got to get out of here. Off to the desert we go. And so you have the birth of the monastery, in essence. And a modern example would be a missionary that goes to a tribe, and there's obviously all sorts of theories about how to evangelize to people best. Do you go and live among them for a certain amount of time, learn the language, learn the customs, and try to adapt Christianity to that? Certainly that would be the liberal approach today. In fact, many missionaries from liberal mainline Protestant churches are hardly missionaries at all. They're hardly bringing the gospel at all. They're more like teachers serving in those communities, which isn't necessarily bad. But they certainly wouldn't present Christ as being opposed to their culture, but sort of coming alongside their culture. And so I think any Christian who's ever thought about the question of the way in which Christians relate to the culture, I think this is one possibility that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot in the world and a lot in any culture that is going to be opposed to the things of God. I don't think that's hard to understand. I also think we can easily think of examples that probably take it too far, or at least we think it takes it too far. The example I always think of is Footloose. I'm not much of a dancer, so that movie just does not resonate with me I am a fan of Volkswagen Bugs, so I mean, I always like Kevin Bacon's car. But John Lithgow, is a very typical Hollywood, vision of what a Christian is. Someone who's opposed to dancing. As I get older, and I watch kids go to raves and rub their body parts against other people's body parts when they're 15 and 16 years old, and this is just all normal, when you would watch MTV's spring break videos, maybe John Lithgow was really onto something in that Footloose. Maybe Kevin Bacon was the end of Western civilization as we know it. Maybe the people complaining about the way Elvis shook his pelvis, maybe they were right to be concerned. Maybe he should have been videoed from the chest up. You know what I'm saying? Maybe the parents who were a little wigged out by the Beatles and their long hair in 1964 were right to be concerned. I mean, we laugh at it all now. I get it. It's all, it's all so innocent now. Well, I mean, these things do have a progression. And as Christians, we need to be able to evaluate the culture. And we need to be able to say what aspect of the culture is opposed to the things of God, and what is adiaphora? What do we have liberty to partake in? What do we have liberty to enjoy? So, but that's kind of the first camp, right? So you have Christ and culture, and they're fundamentally opposed to one another. Extreme versions of that would be Christians that essentially say we have to live in one ghetto or another, either the ghetto of the monastery, the ghetto of our own little safe church bubble. I might even give another example. Some Christians are absolutely convinced that homeschooling is the only possible way to raise kids, the only possible way that you can raise children in a faithful way. Now, I have nothing against homeschooling at all. I think it's a wonderful choice for a lot of people, and I appreciate the meme that says, if you send your kids off to Caesar's school, don't be surprised when they come back a Roman. I get it. My kids are in a public school. I happen to think it's a wonderful public school, and probably 99% of everyone there is way more liberal than me. So, there are other Christians there, other Christian parents, other Christian students for sure, but it's a public school. And I've already heard, a lot of liberal sentiment as I've gotten to know parents and so forth, and I think they'd be tolerant of my sentiments. And every now and then I'm lucky that there's a birthday party and I can have an hour-long conversation with someone about what I believe and why I believe it. But that would be possibly another example of saying, I can't send my kids into a worldly school. Because Christ is opposed to culture, right? You got to pull the kid out. You only listen to Christian rock music. You only watch Christian movies. That would be another example. I mean, the Christians trying to make Christian films. And I guess that's just the way it is, because that's probably the nature of Hollywood, because Hollywood really is the world, and it really is full of rot, gut, sin. But, it would be far better, I think, if there could be films made that had Christian influence without it being a quote-unquote Christian film, right? I mean, that's another kind of ghetto that Christians, they protect themselves by staying away from the world, but they end up not engaging in the world. So, I had one more thought about that. Well, it's a tangent. But gosh, I was reading a review, I'll make this quick, of Suicide Squad, another comic book movie, and the reviews are just terrible. And I'm just sitting here thinking, you know how Hollywood can't make good movies? It's because they're all postmodernists. How can you make a good movie as a postmodernist? Who are the heroes? There aren't any heroes anymore. Everybody's just a worse villain than another. And even postmodernists, after a while, are sick of that artistic drivel. And that's, anyway, isn't that obvious that, it's like people are sitting here going, why can't Hollywood make a good movie? Meanwhile, they espouse the very worldview that makes horrible artwork, which is postmodernism, because it has no foundation. When you have no up or down, when you have no good or bad, when you have no sin and grace, fall and redemption, you're kind of missing out on all the great elements of a worthwhile story. Eventually, you just burn out on the darkness and the emptiness of postmodernity. So, anyway, that's why we have Christian films. But there's a drawback to that too. So I think those would all be some examples of ways that we look at Christ and culture and we see them as fundamentally opposed to each other, so they have to be kept separate. All right, let me keep going. Recognition of a fundamental agreement between Christ and culture is typical of the answers offered by a second group. In them, Jesus often appears as a great hero of human culture history. His life and teachings are regarded as the greatest human achievement. In him, it is believed, the aspirations of men toward their values are brought to a point of culmination. He confirms what is best in the past and guides the process of civilization to its proper goal. Moreover, he is a part of culture in the sense that he himself is part of the social heritage that must be transmitted and conserved. In our time, answers of this kind are given by Christians who note the close relationship between Christianity and Western civilization, between Jesus' teachings or the teachings about him and democratic institutions. Yet there are occasional interpretations that emphasize the agreement between Christ and Eastern culture as well as some that tend to identify him with the spirit of Marxian society. Okay. In other words, there are those who would interpret Christ as being a champion of Western civilization, personal liberty, capitalism to a certain degree, and then there are those who would see Christ as the champion of Marxist ideology. Either way, in each case, the second option then is the way that there is agreement between Christ and culture, that Christ is the example of what is great about culture, and we should adopt it on a Christianity, so to speak, at a culture-wide level, and then that's what's transmitted from generation to generation. Now, I think any Christian, to a certain degree, would agree with this as well. Just as we understand that Christ and culture are opposed to each other, we also would like to think that there is agreement. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as a Christian, I want more people to be Christian. I don't think it can be handed down by force. I think it's something that Christians would have to choose, that Christians would, through their families and through their congregations and through their evangelism, they would promote a Christian and a biblical worldview in their neighborhoods, behind the microphones of radios, handing out flyers on the streets, from the pulpits, in personal relationships. Through all of these ways, Christians say, we want there to be a Christian society. We want there to be a Christian culture. That there is such a thing as a Christian culture. There's certainly at least such a thing as a more Christian culture than a less Christian culture, right? So we want to have a robust Christian culture. I've advocated that for many times. The danger of that would be if you go all the way on that scale, you end up with Christendom, right? Which is where you end up with, say, Europe, where, Christianity was de rigueur. I mean, it was a Christian continent. And to some degree, you would say still is, but in many ways it's not, right? The heartbeat is just about to flail out in many parts of Europe because of Christendom. Christianity became assumed. It became synonymous with the culture. Well, of course we're Christian. I mean, we're Europe. We've always been Christian. I don't even remember a time when we weren't Christian, So that's when it becomes a problem, when bishops and princes are sharing an office. That is to say, it's the same person. This is a problem. When you have a bishop become Lutheran, well, everyone else now has to become Lutheran. Forced baptisms. Anyway, it just becomes so ingrained, and I talked about this a little bit last week when we talked about, is Europe going to be able to defend its Christian heritage, its Christian culture, if there aren't any actual Christians? And, but I think Christendom, that sort of assumed Christian culture where Christianity is kind of the ultimate good, and we're going to work towards that. I think at a private level, with vigor and passion, that's a wonderful thing. But I think when it becomes Christendom, and it's just an assumed part of the culture, you can't have that kind of fundamental agreement. You just can't, because Jesus never allows us to be that comfortable. It's just never that easy to be a Christian, because in the hearts of all men lurks sin, and an awful lot of it. So there's just no way that you can have that kind of fundamental agreement between Christ and culture. You can have it to some degree. You can hope, for example, that the laws that your nation would pass would be rooted on Christian morality, which in many cases they have been, but not all the time, of course. And I think I'm gonna give an example later of a kind of a modern context of how that's all changing, and that's, in my opinion, sad. Because I do want there to be some agreement between Christ and the culture, but we've got to know where the dividing line is. Okay. Now we have three other answers. Remember, he's giving 5 examples of the relationship between Christ and culture. And so the first is, you have the diametrically opposed, and then you've got 3 kind of in the middle. So now we're at the 3 in the middle. So he says 3 other typical answers agree with each other in seeking to maintain the great differences between the 2 principles and in undertaking to hold them together in some unity. They are distinguished from each other by the manner in which each attempts to combine the 2 authorities. One of them, our third type, understands Christ's relation to culture somewhat as the men of the second group do. He is the fulfillment of cultural aspirations and the restorer of the institutions of true society. Yet there is in him something that neither arises out of culture nor contributes directly to it. Christ is indeed a Christ of culture, but he is also a Christ above culture. So that's kind of the third type, Christ above culture. This synthetic type is best represented by Thomas Aquinas and his followers, but it has many other representatives in both early and modern times. I'm a little fuzzy about what that exactly means. I would probably need to read an entire chapter about that. But Christ above culture. So, it's a Christ of culture, but, and that would kind of be part of the corrective, I think, to the second, right? Where you want to understand that Christ and culture are never on equal playing fields. Like if our culture takes on Christ as part of its example, so to speak, you never really want Christ just to be an example, of course, but so be it. If we take on Christ as an example, so be it. But always remember that Christ is above the culture too. Okay. Fourth option, well, this is the Lutheran option, and since I'm a Lutheran, I was glad to see, as I was reading this, I was going, yeah, that sounds right, that sounds right, that sounds right. Oh, this is the Lutheran option. I must be a Lutheran. Okay. Another group of median answers constitutes our fourth type. In these, the duality and inescapable authority of both Christ and culture are recognized, but the opposition between them is also accepted. To those who answer the question in this way, it appears that Christians throughout life are subject to the tension that accompanies obedience to 2 authorities who do not agree, yet must both be obeyed. They refuse to accommodate the claims of Christ to those of secular society, as, in their estimation, men in the second and third groups do. So they are like the Christ against culture believers, that's the first group, remember, yet differ from them in the conviction that obedience to God requires obedience to the institutions of society and loyalty to its members, as well as obedience to a Christ who sits in judgment on that society. That is a tense place to be, my friends. Welcome to Lutheranism. Hence, man is seen as subject to 2 moralities, and as a citizen of 2 worlds that are not only discontinuous, I think, with each other, but largely opposed. In the polarity and tension of Christ and culture, life must be lived precariously and sinfully in the hope of a justification which lies beyond history. Luther may be regarded as the greatest representative of this type, yet many a Christian who is not otherwise a Lutheran finds himself compelled to solve the problem in this way. Okay, so in other words, why is it that Christians can't just retreat, even though we understand that that one cannot? We reject the second model, in other words, because we understand that Christ is always going to be above the culture. Christ is always going to be the final authority. He's always going to have something to say to the authority. So we can't have Christendom. Luther understood what happened when you had Christendom. He saw the corruption firsthand, and the Reformation is largely about, getting rid of that kind of corruption, getting rid of that kind of worldview. So we can't have that. So that kind of puts us in the first camp. And yet, we are compelled, as Christians, to obey our earthly masters. Romans 13 being a famous text where we are to be subservient. And Paul commends Christians to live as good citizens, to pray for all men, and kind of that famous portion of 1 Timothy 2:4, where that disputed text where Paul says God wants all men to be saved, and Calvinist, if I understand it correctly, will generally say, well, God wants all types of men to be saved, because what Paul is doing there is saying to people to pray for your kings. And these kings, of course, were, well, they're a pagan. I mean, they're certainly not believers, right? I mean, they were, in many cases, cruel to Christians. So Paul is saying, pray for these people, because God wants all types of people to be saved, including kings. Some people, of course, look at that and they say, well, this kills the idea of the limited atonement. But anyway, I'm not going to go there. Although it might have some, when we get to the fifth, it might have some relevance. But I particularly like this sentence because it has so much to do with the name of this radio show. In the polarity and tension of Christ and culture, life must be lived precariously and sinfully. That's exactly what Luther meant when he said to sin boldly, right? He said, you don't have a choice. You got to live sinfully. You were created, you're created in the image of God, but we've fallen into sin. So you're going to live in a sinful world, and you're going to be a sinner. The question is, what has God done about it? And so you live precariously and sinfully in this world, and you trust, you look forward to then a justification which lies beyond history. And I think that is the answer to the question of Christ and culture. We're fine. We want Christ to have an impact upon the culture, but we also are obedient to those who lord over us. What do we do when Adolf Hitler is our Führer? Okay, that's a whole other conversation. But generally speaking, Christians are called to obedience, and therefore we live in that tension of being obedient to those who rule over us in this life, in this world, in this culture, while being obedient to God. And certainly that doesn't mean we do anything they say, but generally speaking, it means we're obedient. That means we're going to live sinfully. It doesn't mean we embrace sin, like drunkenness, licentiousness, etc., but we have to live sinfully, and then we hope for reconciliation in the end of time. And that's why when I go to bed at night, my prayer is basically just a sigh because I embrace this worldview. I don't know that I've ever had it articulated just like this, but this is the Lutheran way of viewing the world. I get to the end of the day and I think, gosh, I've lived sinfully this day. Make it all right, Lord. Make it all right. And I'm trust that you're working in all things for good. Okay, fifth type. Finally, is the fifth type in the general series, and as a third of the mediating answers, there is the conversionist solution. Those who offer it understand with the members of the first and the fourth groups that human nature is fallen or perverted, and that this perversion not only appears in culture but is transmitted by it. Hence, the opposition between Christ and all human institutions and customs is to be recognized. Yet the antithesis does not lead either to Christian separation from the world, as with the first group, or to mere endurance in the expectation of a trans-historical salvation, as with the fourth. Christ is seen as the converter of man in his culture and society, not apart from these. For there is no nature without culture, and no turning of men from self and idols to God, save in society. It is in Augustine and the great outlines of this answer seem to be... No. It is in Augustine that the great outlines of this answer seem to be offered. John Calvin makes it explicit. Many others are associated with these two. So there's the Calvinist approach to the question of Christ and culture. And I'm not an expert on Calvinist history, and I don't want to get anything wrong. I've heard all sorts of things about Geneva. I've heard people say that, Geneva was worse than the Inquisition. How many people died under Calvin's watch while he oversaw Geneva. I've heard more charitable expressions of it, which is that Geneva, there were people that died at the hands of the government for violating God's moral law in Geneva. That is true. Other people have said that was standard law throughout Europe. It was just never enforced. But Calvinists, I suppose, and again, I don't want to get this wrong. I want to be very respectful. But they, if this is their understanding of Christ and culture, that Christ is the converter of man in his culture and his society, because what other choice is there, right? Because if you have a culture, you have men. I mean, and let me just read that sentence because it's said, he says it so well. He says, Christ is seen then as the converter of man in his culture and society, not apart from these, for there is no nature without culture, and no turning of men from self and idols to God, save in society. I mean, where else are you going to turn people to Jesus Christ? In the wilderness? No, you're going to do it in society. Therefore, the way that Christ relates to society is one of conversion. And I'm sympathetic to that too, right? I think I said that regarding the second point. I think that Christ relates to the culture, but that my hope would be that Christians would make it a more Christian society. I mean, I don't know why any Christian would be opposed to that. Not from top-down policy, of course, but from bottom-up disciple-making. And that seems to be what... Now, Calvin, of course, did offer, in Geneva, that seems to be what they were doing, right? They were they were living out God's moral law, and there was a price to be paid when some people didn't follow it. Sure, it's not as though it were an inquisition. It was essentially a society in which God's moral law was declared to be the moral law, and the consequences laid out in the Old Testament were declared to be, the consequence. And so it's not like John Calvin just was going around arbitrarily killing people. And by the way, he had a board, he had a council. There are many examples of people who, that John Calvin, I'm certain, advocated not in favor or against their being executed, but other people did as well. So Calvin himself probably gets too bad of a rap for that. I'm sure there's a whole history there that we could do a whole show on. Maybe one day we will. But anyway, I just thought it was helpful to kind of lay out those 5 ways. And my question to you would be, what do you think? What do you think is the relationship between Christ and culture? Should we be hermits? Should we adopt the new monasticism, the new what did I mention last week? The book, and I still didn't look up the author. I apologize. Google the book, the Benedict option. Should we should we go ahead and claim the Benedict option? Because especially in this political season, we see there is no Christian influence right now on what's going on in our country. I mean, not at any really, really high level, So should we become hermits and try to change the culture, at all, or should we just kind of go into a cave and try to save ourselves and keep our kids from corruption? Should we try to make this a Christian society explicitly? Should we try to convert the society to Christ? Do we recognize that there's just always going to be tension and we just have to live sinfully within it as faithful Christians? I hate to say this, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in all those approaches. But certainly I'm going to lean on the Lutheran option. I think that's just the reality. And whatever happened in Geneva, it didn't last. And I'm not saying that it was doomed to fail necessarily, or that they were wrong. I'm not going to say that. It might have been wrong, but I'm not saying that now. My point, though, is that it doesn't seem to be a realistic option. That in the end, the hearts of men are going to turn against Christ, and the idea of a full-scale conversion I don't think is possible. So living faithfully as Christians within the culture seems to be the best option. And no dancing at the parties, kids. No dancing at the parties. Now,